This is Tom Kozlik, the head of public policy and municipal strategy at Hilltop Securities. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this episode of our Hilltop Talks Politics and Finance podcast series for 2026. As a reminder, during these Hilltop Talks discussions with subject matter experts, we consider topics that intersect the areas of politics and finance at the federal, state, and local levels in the U.S. We often concentrate on issues related to U.S. public finance and the municipal bond market. Today, we're going to be revisiting a topic that we have spoken about before, but the potential threat, I think, over the last couple of weeks has only increased, and I wanted to get our guests' take on that. And the topic is that of cybersecurity in public finance. So we're going to be welcoming a friend of the podcast, Omid Rahmani from Fitch Ratings. Welcome back, Omid, and thanks for coming back to chat with us.
Thank you so much, Tom. It's always a privilege to be here.
So Omid is an associate director in Fitch's U.S. Public Finance Tax Supporter Group in Austin, Texas, where he leads the public finance cyber risk and emerging technologies practice. In his ratings analytical work, he covers local government issuers in Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona. In addition, he also serves in the global cyber risk team representing public finance. Before joining Fitch, Omid worked at another rating agency, and he is also an active Andean archaeologist. Again, Omid, thank you for coming back, and I'm going to jump right in because at the start of this week, on the cover of the Wall Street Journal, there was a title, Trump Threatens Iranian Power Plants. And over the last couple of weeks since the conflict in Iran escalated, I have been thinking that the potential for cyber risk to public finance has only escalated. But when I see articles like this, it makes me think of the increased risk to infrastructure. From your vantage point, how has the current conflict changed the cyber risk environment for municipalities and U.S. public finance?
Yeah, it's an interesting time to be talking about this topic, Tom. I think just less than 24 hours ago, there was a notice that was put out, a joint notice by the FBI, the NSA, CISA, the EPA, and the Department of Energy about how Iranian cyber actors are launching attacks to disrupt U.S. energy and water infrastructure. And a lot of that is on the municipal scale, since most critical infrastructure in the United States is local critical infrastructure. And as critical infrastructure, it's interesting. The state of its defensive postures across the sector varies. Some sectors have really good support and really good defenses. Other sectors have larger areas of opportunity. And right now, they're all operating in an environment where there's been significant cuts to our organizations that deal with defensive capabilities. And in this new proposed federal budget, there's further, especially staffing cuts to those organizations as well. So it's a really interesting time to be doing it. We're dealing with some emerging technologies and some emerging risks. We've now had Viper attacks. I know you and I talked about Vipers in one of the last episodes, but we've now had documented Viper attacks against the United States by threat actors that are representing themselves as affiliates of our adversary in this conflict. In addition to that, the highly dynamic and evolving world of AI, especially when it comes to agentic AI and its risks, all play into a really, really interesting time to be observing this challenge and seeing the risk landscape shift and change.
So why should cities, counties, and other local governments pay attention to what's happening? I mean, you've kind of laid out the increased threat landscape briefly, but why is it that they should be paying attention if they're not directly involved in foreign policy or defense?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that's a point that I often talk about. So American government here is very unique. It's very much separated into federal, state, and local. And all those different levels have very strict guidelines as to what their roles and responsibilities are. and especially how monies get paid around and used by the various levels and appropriated from the federal government down. Our adversaries don't see that. Our adversaries see American government as American government. For them, a municipal entity is just as legitimate of a target as any of the federal agencies or federal departments. As a result, municipal entities and local government actors have an outsized risk when it comes to geopolitical conflicts because they are deemed as legitimate targets by our adversaries. And we're in real time seeing this. I mean, at the time of the recording of this episode, since last evening, there's now a 2-week ceasefire in place. It's a very tenuous ceasefire. Only time will tell what will come out of it. But even in that, even since the announcement of the ceasefire, it doesn't seem like targeting activities in cyberspace have changed. So it just goes to show you how the cyber battlefield operates concurrent, but very different than in the kinetic battlefield. And in that cyber battlefield, all U.S. government entities, including local governments, are legitimate targets.
So federal agencies have been fairly direct in recent years about kind of affiliated cyber actors and the threat from certain kind of nation states and related organizations. You just mentioned that CISA, I think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but if I understood you correctly, CISA just posted a notice.
That's correct.
Could you tell our listeners a little bit about that notice, where they can find it, and if organizations like the FBI or the Department of Homeland Security, what else they're saying specifically about threats to U.S. critical infrastructure and government service? Because then I'm going to follow up and say, when we see warnings like that, what should a public finance entity, what should a municipal chief investment officer or information officer or finance director or city manager, like what should they be taking away from those messages that we're getting from the folks at the federal government?
Yeah. So obviously at the start of the conflict, in the course of the last 365 days, we've now been involved in 2 kinetic conflicts with Iran. And during the first very brief conflict in the summer, Seas put out a notice. And at the beginning of this conflict, they put out blanket notices. Notice that one out last night is actually a much more detailed notice and very directed notice. And it's very interesting because what the joint cyber defense arms of these agencies are claiming is that they have observed Iranian affiliated advanced persistent threat actors conducting exploitative attacks targeting internet-facing operational technology or OT devices. So specifically, we're talking about critical infrastructure here. What they're saying is that these threat actors are specifically going after SCADA systems. And these are the critical systems that run things like water treatment, fuel and energy, manufacturing, public power. They're used in airports. I mean, they're used across infrastructure widely. And one of the challenges with ICS has been, to date, there's no such ICS system that is built with the ground up with cybersecurity as one of its key design features. So these systems can be a little bit more challenging to protect. You basically have to sandbag them, and then that comes down to the ability of those individual critical infrastructure entities. For example, a small water treatment plant, they just may not have the budget, the personnel, or the sophistication to be able to defend these really critical systems that deliver critical services as much as some of the much larger private sector actors, for example, in manufacturing. But we've seen just in the last month that Iranian affiliated threat actors have gone after some of the world's largest manufacturers with cyber weapons, with specifically Viper weapons, and successfully have been able to wreak havoc in those. So this is something that, like I said before, the beginning of this war was hypothetical because it had never actually occurred to the United States, but now we've sort of crossed that threshold.
Is there something that was included in the recent CISA notice that we should talk about in more detail?
It's specifically just about, hey, like they're targeting. I mean, it gets pretty technical because it goes into like the various PLCs and device. But the general message is that the threat actors are specifically targeting SCADA. So they're targeting things like water treatment. And as you're well aware, we've talked about this a couple of years ago. This is not the first time that Iranian affiliated threat actors have focused on a campaign targeting water, the water industry. It happened in the aftermath of the conflict with Hamas after October 7th as well.
So if we step back and look at kind of even that recent experience that public finance has gone through with the cyber threat, it's not new. We've seen nation state linked activity hit, as you were just describing, different entities in the sector before. What does that tell us about how different nation state or nation state related entities are targeting U.S. municipal infrastructure, and what does that mean for local governments right now?
So we're entering a new era of conflict and warfare where the cyber battlefield and the cyber landscape is deemed as a legitimate target. And in fact, it is a lot more legitimate target in many ways than the kinetic battlefield, because the costs are much less for the attacker in the cyber battlefield, and the returns are much greater because your losses generally when you're conducting operations don't necessarily involve kinetic losses. So low intensity cyber sabotage, cyber espionage is something that has been going on for a while now. We really saw it come into play after the conflict in Eastern Europe touched off a few years ago. And it's been the case ever since. Now that's only increasing because one challenge, for example, one thing that is in the past, one challenge for our adversaries and one benefit that the United States has had is the ability for the homeland to be protected from direct blowback or direct impact of kinetic conflicts around the world. With the cyber battlefield, that is changing because now our adversaries in the situation where we are involved in a direct kinetic conflict can target the homeland and can target entities in the homeland. And as we're seeing, they are very interested in critical infrastructure and entities. They are interested in local government entities. We have seen an uptick in attacks from such affiliated actors against those sectors. And now we're getting the official recognition of that from CISA, FBI, EPA, and Department of Energy.
So let's get specific. In the near term, what type of attack, like what you and I have focused on over the last couple of years, ransomware is one of the common threats that folks in the public entity space think about, concentrate. They might have been concentrating on that, over the last decade. But one of the things that you and I have talked about over the last couple of years is the increase for havoc-based type attacks. Could you talk a little? Could you?
Yeah.
I was going to say, could you talk a little bit more about specific types of attacks that the public entities should be preparing for?
Yeah. So let me first take a step back and make a clarification. So the majority of cyber attacks, by far, that we're observing and seeing is going to be financially motivated cybercrime. Now, the goals are different for a financially motivated threat actor and a havoc-based threat actor. A financially motivated threat actor, for example, in the case of ransomware, which is the most common thing that our entities deal with, they don't necessarily have a vested interest in completely destroying or damaging their victims. They want to be able to make sure that they can get paid and still be able to have their credibility maintained. A havoc-based threat actor, a nation state that's involved in a kinetic conflict, they have different goals. Their goal is to do damage. Their goal is to cause pain. Their goal is simply to disrupt and, in worst cases, destroy. And some of those attacks, although in cyberspace, can have kinetic consequences. And that's what the federal agencies have been talking about for the past couple of years, is the potential for these havoc-based threat actors, when they do conduct attacks, for the potential for kinetic impact. And in the past, both CISA and FBI directors have openly said, which could ultimately result in loss of life in the homeland.
And so as I'm thinking about it, on the one hand, oftentimes when people think about cyber attack, they immediately will think of finance or related or ransomware attack. They might think about data But oftentimes, I think what gets missed is the potential for service disruption. If a cyber attack is tied to the conflict that's going on in the Middle East, for example, a public entity is hit. What could that mean for essential municipal services?
Yeah, so obviously if it's a successful attack that's designed to cause havoc, cause disruption, or at worst destruction, that can have really significant impacts on that entity, and also it can have downstream risk. When we talk about critical infrastructure, we have to realize that specific sectors by their nature are key to the regions that they serve, and other entities need their services to be able to function. So for example, we're talking about things like water and power as an example. Those are entities that can have blowback on other issuers and other entities if there is significant disruption. And the scale of these disruption and destruction attacks can be different. Obviously, we talked a little bit about Vipers before. There can be attacks designed to specifically damage your networks. There can be attacks that are designed to use components within your network to then damage your physical infrastructure. There's a wide range of things that can be done. But for me, I think the most critical thing that the municipal entities need to be very aware of is business continuity, because that's exactly what we're talking about here when we're talking about service disruptions. I think that's becoming, for me, the real critical component of just understanding and digesting the cyber hygiene posture of an entity that I'm talking to, is how well they're equipped to get back on their feet and continue providing critical services after experiencing a disruption. And I think the range of that varies widely, unfortunately, across the public finance sphere. It's gotten better, certainly in the last 6 years or so since COVID, but there's still great areas of opportunity when it comes to things like risk management and incident response planning, because at the end of the day, when we're talking about service disruptions, we're not necessarily just talking about a technology challenge. Now we're talking about a risk management and governance challenge. And
I've
it's
always liked. I'm
I
sorry.
was just going to say, and it's in that portion that we also see rating pressure as well.
I've always liked that concept that you use of cyber hygiene. So, with regard to continuity, like you just mentioned, the way that I'm thinking about it is that very few public entities run everything in-house anymore. They rely on different providers, different vendors. During a kind of increased level of geopolitical conflict as we're experiencing right now, how is it that public entities should think about the dependency on those outside providers and outside vendors?
Yeah, so that's a really great point, and it's a point that became sort of very obvious during the conflict. For example, a lot of people use cloud services, a lot of people use various large scale enterprise level third party solutions that are used widely across various industries, including in the public sector. And what we saw with the current conflict was the active targeting, for example, of the infrastructure that maintains that mesh. And so what became clear is that there is such a thing as major technology infrastructure bottlenecks just by virtue of the fact that there's only so many vendors that have the economies of scale to provide specific services. So that's one challenge that we observed during the war and the cybersecurity community started talking about. Another challenge is just understanding how to do vendor risk management. Obviously, as you mentioned, public entities do business with all kinds of vendors. And what we've seen in the last few years is the rise of supply chain cyber risk. Basically, cyber risks that target a vendor, and then through that vendor, they can have an outsized impact on a large number of organizations. And for me, that goes back to governance and risk management. These entities need to be having very detailed conversations, and they need to have very different understanding of the standards of cybersecurity that they institute and implement, and how that relates to their vendors and other organizations that have access to their networks.
So, do public entities face more indirect, a threat from a indirect impact than a direct impact?
No, I think that's difficult to say. I would say both. We've observed both. When it comes to the direct impact, by a wide margin, that's still financially motivated crime. Now, sure, in times of geopolitical rift, we do see an uptick in other types of attacks, hacktivism, havoc-based attacks. We've seen all those in the last month. But we've also seen the public sector be impacted by major supply chain attacks on vendors that have not only affected local governments, but state and federal governments, as well as the private sector as well simultaneously. And I think when we're talking about technology infrastructure bottlenecks, that is a way of observing how those bottlenecks can have an impact, and it can have an outsized impact on the sector.
So one of the big topics for 2026 is how AI is changing the landscape.
Yep.
How is AI changing the cyber threat landscape, and what are the real threats that folks on the public entity side should be thinking about related to AI as it is connected to uh, cyber threats?
Yeah, so AI, especially right now with the rise of agentic AI, is really transforming everything, in my opinion. It may be one of the most transformative events of our lifetime. For the security side, it's really increasing the number of tools that the threat actors have at their disposal to carry out things like phishing campaigns, to be able to automate their attacks. And we are also seeing it used on the defensive side as well, for things like streamlining logs, being able to do threat detection better. So it has a utilization on both the offensive and the defensive side. Currently, it's seeing more of an evolution on the offensive side, by virtue of the fact that this is an emerging technology and the threat actors always have to be more creative about how to puncture defenses. And that's always been the case, Tom. What AI is doing is it's just really speeding up that process. So the anticipation of that is there may be a gap period where there's just greater offensive capabilities for it than defensive capabilities. And for me, that brings it back to governance. That brings it back to your cyber hygiene posture organizationally, vertically in your organization. And again, your response planning, because as we're seeing, and we've already seen it have an impact on ratings, it is in that response phase that really organizations can demonstrate how prepared they are for business continuity and maintaining their critical services in case of attack.
So cyber insurance comes up quickly in almost any conversation with public entities and cyber threats. The Public Finance Leaders Survey that we published back in September of 2025 had a question about cyber insurance, and nearly half of the people who responded said that they are somewhat confident in their cyber insurance policies, and they think that it's sufficient enough to cover financial risks associated with data governance. Only 18% reported that they were very confident, and another 29% are skeptical. So the responses are kind of all over the map where that's concerned. In your mind, what role does cyber insurance realistically play for public entities facing these threats going forward?
Are we specifically talking about these geopolitical threats? In the case of these geopolitical threats, the cyber insurance is not probably the best tool in the toolbox, because since several years ago, insurance companies have began to implement act of war exclusions in relation to their cyber policies, basically allowing them to deny coverage for state-backed attacks. And in the case of a lot of these type of havoc-based attacks related to conflicts, these attacks are carried out by politically motivated groups, most of the time state-backed actors. There's ambiguity in attribution for the insurance companies, and their state-backed exclusions further allow them to be able to delay or deny claims in relation to these entities and how they're getting targeted. Now, one of the main benefits that we've seen with cyber insurance has been the willingness of the insurance companies to send the teams to help these entities in getting back on their feet and getting back to business as usual. And in the case of ransomware, we have seen that for organizations that have effective cyber insurance that make a difference in the recovery phase. But with these act of war exclusions, those services and the sort of certainness that you're going to get made whole for your incident really evaporate. And again, it falls back to the entities themselves to take responsibility for their cyber hygiene, for their cyber governance, and their recovery posture, especially in the current federal environment where we've seen a real retraction of the federal cyber defensive workforce, which in the past has been able to play some role for the sector when it comes to defense and recovery. The shrinking of that workforce puts more of the responsibility and more of the onus on the issuers themselves. In cases of being targeted by state actors, they have to be aware that their cyber policies may not come into play because of those act of war exclusions.
That's a really good segue into the last thing that I wanted to ask you about, Omid, and that has to do with where federal support stands. And you alluded to it when we first started talking, when you were saying that there have been some budget cuts. Could you talk a little bit more specifically about what the federal support landscape actually looks like for public entities right now?
Yeah, so I would say the federal support landscape across the various sectors of public finance have been asymmetric to begin with. Some sectors like public power have enjoyed more direct involvement, more assistance from the government than some of the other sectors. And so to begin with, it's a little bit different for each sector. And also the reporting requirements and the current laws in place can be sort of different and can impact sectors differently. For example, when we talk about things like laws associated with confidentiality, that comes into play with school districts and with healthcare. As we've seen the last couple of years, there has been a downsizing in the federal workforce in general. And that has also happened in the federal defensive work or defensive cyber workforce. We've seen downsizings, for example, at CISA, at DC3, when it comes to these programs that in the past have been able to go and work with the municipalities, provide assistance to them. Based on my understanding of this new federal proposed budget, there's further downsizing to some of those programs. Now, there is funding for other types of cyber programs, mostly on the federal level for Department of Defense, for example, and some of the offensive capabilities. But as far as some of the specific programs that have benefited local governments, those programs seem to not be receiving the kind of funding that may be necessary to step up to meet the dearth in both investment, when we're talking about just financial investment, direct financial investment, as well as workforce on the local government level and including local critical infrastructure. So again, for me, all of that combined just puts the onus more on the entities themselves that, this is just going to have to become a real critical part of governance and risk management, where these entities have to take responsibility for their own defense. And unfortunately, this is at a time when these entities are finding themselves on the front lines of geopolitical conflicts, where decisions, talking about decisions the federal government is making or decisions other entities around the world are making, may have a direct impact on their business and on their security.
Okay. Well, Omid, we're going to end it there. Thank you very much. I appreciate you coming back to talk about the threat landscape that we're looking at with regard to cybersecurity and public entities. I appreciate your time today.
It's always a pleasure to be with you guys.
And thanks very much to those who tuned in and downloaded our recording today. And we really appreciate you listening. I'm going to thank Omid again for joining us. I enjoyed this discussion. For those interested, you can see the recent Hilltop Securities economic and municipal commentary and listen to our podcasts by going to hilltopsecurities.com/commentary. You can follow me on X and LinkedIn. Thanks again, everyone. We look forward to bringing you more color in the future related to topics that intersect the world of politics, finance, and public finance. This has been Tom Kozlik from Hilltop Securities.